Hi everyone, today's video is a little bit different. We just hit 1,000 subscribers, and to celebrate this milestone, we're going to be making this interactive blob of a thing where each of these colorful blobs represents each one of you. There are 1,000 and a little bit of them. It is going to be a fun one, so stick around. Before we get started, thank you so much for being a part of this community. I hope that you enjoy watching my content as much as I enjoy making them. But why stop there? Let's make it even better. Let me know, what is your biggest struggle when learning to code? It will really help me curate my content and continue to provide value to all of you. And as a thank you, I have created a creative coding math toolkit that I think will be really useful for all of you and a great supplement in your learning journey. Again, thank you so much, and now back to the tutorial. So first, we're going to draw a blob. So let's start by drawing a circle. So we're gonna draw using an ellipse function, and an ellipse function takes in a total of 4 arguments. The first 2 are gonna be the x and y coordinate of the center of the circle, and then the third and the fourth are gonna be the width and the height. So I want to draw it at the center of the canvas, so I'm going to give it width divided by 2 and height divided by 2, and I'm going to give it a size of 200. Instead of giving it width divided by 2 and height divided by 2 here, what I want to do is that I want to translate the origin point that is at the top left corner of my canvas to the middle of the canvas, so that instead of giving these values here, I want to just give it at 0, 0. So I can use a translate function, and I'm gonna translate the origin point to the middle of the canvas. And if I click play, it should be exactly the same. To draw a blob, we cannot just use an ellipse function. Your question is, what is a blob exactly? So in my definition, essentially it is still going to be in the shape of a circle, but I want the outline of this blob to be a little bit organic-like. So it's not going to be this clean line of a circle. And to do that, we need to be able to draw points around this circular shape. So instead of using an ellipse function, I'm going to use a vertex function. A vertex function allows us to draw a set of points, like set of vertices, and we're going to be using 3 main functions, and these are going to be begin shape, the vertex function, and end shape. So let's just try to see how a vertex function works. So let's give it, we need to give it at least, I think if we give it 2 points, 2 vertex points, it's just gonna be a line. But let's just give it a try. Let's do 50, 100, and 50, how about 100, 200. All right, so it does a line, right? But if you give it a third component, I'm gonna change this a little bit so it's not off the screen. All right, and then if the last one is, let's say 140, and now if you have at least 3 points, then it can actually make a shape, right? And you can, or you don't have to, but if you don't want this white filling here, you can just add the function no fill. All right, so now we kind of understand how a vertex function works, right? What we want to do is that instead of drawing the circle using an ellipse function, right, we want to draw a set of many points that make up a circle. To do that, I am going to use a for loop. And the for loop will start from 0, and it will go from 0 to 360, right? And 0 to 360 is what? It's the angle, right? What we need to do is that we need to be able to convert from polar coordinates to Cartesian coordinates. The main components of polar coordinates are 1, the angle, which we already have here, from 0 to 360. And the second component is the radius. In Cartesian coordinates, we need to convert it to x and y. And we can do that by using trigonometry. And I have a whole set of videos that goes through how to convert from polar coordinates to Cartesian coordinates, which I will link down below. But essentially what we need is that we need these two equations. So I'm gonna set two new variables, x equals to radius times cosine of the angle I, and then the other one is y equals to radius of sine of angle I. And before I do anything here, I will come here under the setup function and change the angle mode to degrees. So within p5.js, the default angle mode is in radians. We're not going to go into the details of what radians are right now, but because we're going to be using the degree mode, we need to make sure that we write this line of code so that the computer or the program knows that we're using the mode of degrees at the moment. All right, so now that we have calculated x and y, we are going to set the vertices to location of x and y. All right, let's try this. Oh, and we also need to set radius to 200. All right, and you can see that the radius here is much larger, right, than before, even though it's the same 200, and it is because it is the diameter that is 400 now, and it's not 200. So if we set this to 100, now we get the same size of the circle that we had initially. So now we successfully draw a circle using a bunch of vertices instead of using an ellipse function, but it's still not a blob. To make a blob, we need to be able to change the size of the radius, which right now we set it at 100, which essentially makes a perfect circle here. So first, let's move this radius variable inside our for loop. And what we want to do is that we want to, instead of just having it at a fixed 100, we want to add a certain increment to the radius variable, but we don't actually want to use a random function, right? We want it to be more organic. So we're going to use a function called noise, and noise can take up to 3 arguments, but because we're working in 1D, we're only going to give it 1 argument. But before I do any of this, I'm going to delete this first. I want to print out a value of noise to actually show you how it works. So I given an argument of 0, right? So as you can see here, when I print noise of 0, it keeps printing the same exact number every single time, which means that at every run of the program and at a specific argument that you put in the noise function, it outputs the same number. But if you were to change this, then the number changes. Another thing that you should notice is that the output is between 0 and 1. So what if I were to make a draw loop that goes from I equals to 0 to I equals to 9, and I'm going to now print noise, and then I'm going to set let's do offset here, and I'm gonna increment and offset by a certain amount. Let's do 1, and every time the draw function is called, I want to reset the offset to 0. So let's print this. All right, so you can see here that the numbers are between 0 and 1, right? And the numbers are still kind of random, right? 0.6, 0.55, 0.57, 0.51, but they're quite close to each other. And this really depends on what is an offset that you put. Because I put 1, the offset is a little bit large. What if I put 0.1 here? And then you can see that the numbers are much closer to each other, right? Like 0.568, 0.565, 0.584. So increments, or the offset that you put here, really matters in terms of how close each of the points or each of the outputs that the noise function provides. If you're still confused about how a noise function works, don't worry, I have a whole set of videos where I explain what Perlin noise is and a bunch of exercise, so go check those out. So we want to increment it by a certain amount, and as I mentioned, we want to use the function noise, right? So noise actually outputs a value between 0 and 1, and that's why we also want to map it to, let's do it to larger than 0 and 1, because if not, then we can't see the change, right? So let's do 0 and how about 5? And now let's run. And the reason that you don't see anything at all right now is because, like I said before, noise of 0, every time you call it draw function, it is set to the same specific number, right? So what you want to do is that instead of putting in 0 here, you want to put an offset value, and we're going to set this offset at 0 every time the draw function is called, and we want to increment offset by a certain amount. Let's do 0.1, and there you go. You can see this organic shape. So like I said before, increments really matter. So what if I set an offset by 1 every time it goes through this draw loop? You can see that it's a lot more rough, right? And you can change the value here to be, more, or it can be more spiky like this. I like it a little bit smoother, so I'm going to set the offset to be at 0.1. So now you can see how we can make a blob. So let's create a class called blob where we are going to put the code that we just wrote inside. All right, so you come to sketch file here and click create file, and I'm going to call this file blob.js. And before we start writing a new class, let's go to index.html file and copy this line of code and change the name here to the name of your new JavaScript file. This is a way for you to integrate your new file into the program. All right, so let's go back to blob.js. So we start by writing the word class, and then I'm gonna call it blob. And then inside the constructor function, we're gonna give it 3, let's do R here. We're gonna give it 3 parameters, X, Y, and R. And then I'm gonna set 3 variables to X, Y, and R. All right, and then we're gonna draw it out. And essentially, you can just go back to sketch.js file and copy what we already wrote here. We do need to tweak slightly. The first thing that we need to tweak is that we need to now translate it to this.x and this.y. And yeah, 100 here. Actually, we want to set this.r to be here, and that's it. Let's just try and go back to sketch.js file, and how about we create a new blob object called b, and b is a new blob, and we're gonna put it in the center of our canvas just to see if everything works. And we're gonna give a size of 100, and then we're gonna draw it. Create object URL. That was a very interesting error I have never seen before, so if you know, let me know. But essentially, I cannot name the class blob. So I changed everything to shape, so now the class is called shape. And in the sketch function, I just essentially just created an object named b. It's a new object within the class shape. And then I put it at the exact same spot, right? In the middle of the canvas, and the radius size is 100. And then I call the display method, and now we have one of the blobs here. We want to create a bunch of blobs. I'm actually now not sure if I can use a variable called blobs. I'm gonna give it a try. So first, I'm going to create a variable called blobs of a type array. And what we're gonna do is that we're gonna create a 2D array. So we also need columns, rows, and also size. But I'm gonna call it grid size here because it's gonna be the size of the grid, which is going to be a different size as the size of the blobs. So I'm gonna set it at, let's start with 50. Actually, let's do 10. Let's just start small because we have a set number of columns and rows that we want. And we want it at 32 because 32 times 32 is 1024. It's more than 1,000, and we know that this community is gonna grow, so let's just stick with that. And then I'm also want to set the blob size, and I want to set the blob size to be smaller than the grid size, so let's do 5. Within the setup function now, we're gonna create a 2D array, and we're gonna do that using a nested for loop. So let I equals to 0, I less than columns and I plus plus, and then let j equals to 0, j less than rows, and j plus plus. I have done a bunch of these tutorial on how to make a 2D array, so please check that out if you're not familiar. Within the outer loop, we're going to now populate the 2D array with a bunch of empty 1D arrays, and then within the inner loop, that's where we're going to create a bunch of new blobs under the class shape. Alright, so we can just copy this. And I'm going to delete this. Also going to delete the variable b here, but we don't want to set it at width divided by 2 and height divided by 2. We want it to be at I times the grid size, j times the grid size, and we want this to be the blob size. And then underneath the draw function, instead of just calling one object b, we're going to also use a nested for loop. So I'm going to just copy and paste this, and we're going to call the display method on all of the objects inside the blobs 2D array. Fingers crossed that the blobs array would work. Alrighty, it does work, trust me, but the fact that it's all here is because of this. So if you go back to the shape class, it's because of this translate function here. The reason that you see what you see right now is because when we use a translate function, we have transformed, or we have changed the transformation of the shapes, right? Of like the canvas. And so because we're drawing a grid of these shapes, we need to first save the transformation, draw the shapes, and then we need to return it back to the original state before we call it again. So to do that, we need two functions called push and pop, and we're just gonna put it at the beginning and at the end here. Once we do this, the push and pop function, basically, it saves the transformation and then it returns the transformation back. And we do that every time right before we call a new of these shapes. All right, but now they're super close to each other, and you can see that it's quite spiky, and that's because we draw very small shapes. So instead of mapping the noise offset from 0 to 5, what if we just do a smaller one from 0 to 2? Okay, and then let's go back to sketch. Maybe we do a little bit slightly bigger grid size to 11. Okay, that's better. And maybe we do a smaller blob size to 3. Nah, I like it at 5. What I want to do next actually is I want to move this whole grid to the middle of the canvas. First, I'm going to first move the first row and the first column by offsetting it by grid size divided by 2 plus here, and grid size divided by 2 plus. Alright, so now we see the whole shape. Because the size of this is at 400, we want to create a margin basically of 25. So I'm going to add 25 to the first two arguments here. I know that this is very, we're essentially hard coding. So if you were to do a different size that is not the canvas size of 400 by 400, it's going to be different. So you will need to calculate what you need as the margin size. But for my size, 25 here is a good margin. The second step is that we are going to import an image, and we're going to use this image as a guideline for us to either draw the shapes by filling in the colors or draw just the stroke of the shapes, right? And we're going to do that by essentially looking at the brightness colors of each of the pixels of our image and then map it to the shapes here. First, come here, and then we're going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call that folder images. Then inside this, I'm going to upload the image, and the image I have is the image of the 1000 number. All right, you can just drag it in here. So now we want to prep an image before we do anything. So first, create a new variable. I'm going to call it img. Then we need to use a function. This function is called preload. And preload, basically, we're going to preloading this image. So we're going to set this variable img to a function called load image. And then inside this argument here, we need to tell it where the image is. We're going to use the one quotation mark sign here. And then the image, the source image is in the folder images, right? So as you can see here, it's in the folder images, and then the name of the file is 1000.png. So you just put in images, backslash, and then 1000.png. All right, so now we have this. I am going to just show you that the image is already there by calling the function called image, and then the name of our file, and then where we want to place it. I want to place it at the top left corner at 0, 0. All right, so now we have this image. I made the size of the image to be exactly 400 by 400, which is the size of the canvas, so I don't need to change anything. But if you want to resize the image, let's say that your image is not off the size, the same size as your canvas, what you can do is that you can put the name of your file, and then you can use the function called resize, and you can just put the width that you want. Let's say you want half of the width here, so 200. And then if you don't want to manually change the height of the image, you want it to change proportionally to what the original size of the image is, you just put in 0. And if you do this, you can see that now my image shrunk by half. All right, so I don't need this. I also don't need to draw this either. Now what I want to do is that I want to extract the brightness value of this 1000 image here, of the original size, right? Right now we have already cut up the canvas by a certain number of columns and rows, and then within that, I'm going to get a specific brightness value of this image at that specific pixel. So what I can do is I can come back to my 2D array here. I'm going to set a new variable called C, and C first is going to get the color. So the color I can do by writing the name of that image, and then get. This function gets the color value of the location that you put in, the location of the pixel. So I'm going to put in I times grid size and j times grid size. And then if I were to print this, you can see that we get a bunch of white and black colors, right? And we also get the transparency value as well. But that's not what we want. We actually want just the brightness. And we can get that value by using the function called brightness. And then you give an argument of a specific color. So it's going to be the value you see here. So if I print this, you can see that the values that we get are either 0 or 100, and then occasionally you get some values between 40 and 60. Okay, so that's what we want. What are we going to use the brightness value for? Right? In the original image that you can see, basically we want to be able to draw the number 1000, and the 1000 I want to fill it with a color, while the brightness that is essentially white, I want to just draw a stroke on these shapes. First, I'm going to create a new variable called, let's call it brightness. And brightness is going to be brightness of C, right? But this gives me a value between 0 and 100, but I don't want it to be, I want the value between 0 and 1, because in the class later I want to do a conditional statement that says if brightness equals to 0, then do this. If the brightness is equals to 1, then do that. So I'm going to map it from 0 to 100 to 0 to 1. All right, and then I'm going to give a new argument here, brightness. Then now we need to go back to the class and give it a new parameter called brightness. And this dot brightness is going to be brightness. All right. And now within our display function, I'm going to create a conditional statement. So if this dot brightness is equals to 0, then I want to, so that's going to be white. Maybe that's black. I'm not sure, but let's just try it. So if this is white, then I want to set the stroke color to be black, and I don't want it to fill anything else. So if it's not white, it's any other color, then I want it to I want to fill it with the color black. How about that? Let's try this. Cannot access brightness before initialization. Maybe I can't use, just do B here. Let's try that. All right, I guess I couldn't use the variable named brightness. All right, so two things that I want to fix. First, I switched this. I want if brightness is 1. So that's the first thing I wanted to fix. The second thing is that you can see that now the image is off the screen a little bit. It is because the size of my shapes here are of the size 350, right? Even though the canvas is of the size 400, this is slightly smaller. So I'm going to resize my image, and I can do that by writing image dot resize 350, comma 0. All right, so now it fits in the screen. Almost there, almost there. The next thing that we want to do is, this color is kind of boring, so let's change the color. So go back to shape.js. I'm going to create a new variable called C, and C is gonna give me a random value between 0 and 7, or 0 and 6999999. But actually I want it to be between 0 and 6, right? So not a decimal point, I want an integer. So I'm gonna use the function called floor. The reason that I want to do this is that I want to use this .c as an index value. So now I'm going to create a new variable called shape colors, and shape colors is going to be a set of very beautiful color palette. Ta-da! Okay, the stroke will be set to shape colors of this.c, and then fill will be shape colors of this.c. Let's give it a try. All right, and in the fill one, I actually want the stroke to be white, and I want the stroke weight here to be 1.5, and the stroke weight for the rest to be at its default value of 1. All right, okay, so now if we go back to sketch.js, let's change the background color to dark blue. If you want to stop here, you totally can, but I'm gonna go a little bit further to make it a little bit more dynamic. How dynamic is it gonna be? Essentially, I want to make it interactive by, first, I want to make all of these blobs to be a perfect circle. And then whenever I move the mouse close to the shapes, I want it to become a blob. And I can do that by writing a new function, and I'm gonna call this function mouse hover. And this function is gonna take in one argument called d. To be able to create this mouse hover effect, we basically need to figure out the distance between the mouse location and the circles or the blobs. So I'm gonna set a new variable called distance, and distance is gonna be the distance between exactly that, the center of the blobs and the mouse location. And I can figure out the distance by using the dist function, which is a function within p5.js. So this.x, comma this.y, that's the first point, and then mouse x and mouse y, which is the second point and is the mouse location. And so I'm gonna write a conditional statement that says, if distance is less than d, and we can set d to whatever we want, then I want to change these two values here, 0 and 2, right? I want to first, if I were to set this to 0 and 0, it's a perfect circle, right? So let's come back here, and then let's do this dot min is 0, and this dot max is, let's start at 0, and then we're gonna change, where is it? Here. We're gonna change this offset radius here to min and max, and then if the distance is less than d, meaning that the mouse is close to the center, then I want this dot max to be 2. Other than that, I want this dot max to be 0. Okay, so now do you see? They're all perfect circles. Oh, and we have not called mouse hover method yet. And I want to call this mouse hover method within the display function, the display method within this class. And we can do it by essentially just write the word this and dot, and then the name of the function, which is mouse hover. And then I'm going to give it 20, the distance between the mouse and the center of each of these blobs. So let's try this. Do you see that? And you can play around with this variable here. What if we do 50? So you can play around with a lot of different variables, but this is a good starting point for you to make something interactive and fun, visually engaging. Again, thank you so much for watching and being a part of this community. I'm so happy to finally hit 1,000 and hope to grow together with you and do a lot more of these fun tutorials. Bye!